I'm Carlos Finley. I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a native Mobilian, but I've been fortunate to not only live in Mobile, Alabama. I lived in Michigan, I've lived in Texas, I've lived in Louisiana, I've lived in California. I say fortunate because in order for you to get to know me and for me to get to know others, it's important that we all travel and that we understand that different people come from different places and they're not necessarily right or wrong, they're just different. Speaking of being different, it is the strength of our country that we are such a diverse nation. Our differences is what I feel truly make us strong and they make us better. But we haven't always been appreciated for those differences. So I'm coming to you today in light of current situations that have happened in our country regarding individuals being treated in less than a just manner by members of law enforcement. From Georgia to Kentucky, Minnesota, all across this country, we know of instances where African Americans have been treated unjustly by members of law enforcement and as a result have lost their lives. So I want to tell you about all the different places that I've lived so you don't just think that my perspective only comes from Mobile, Alabama. I've seen racism and I've seen wonderful people all over this country. There are no boundaries for injustice. Right now, we've got people who are looting, who are burning, who are protesting. What I feel important that we all realize is that whatever those circumstances are, and however you feel about them, they've been brought about. An environment has been created because of injustices that has been visited upon people of color. I want you to think about the pictures that you see of police stations burning, of local businesses on fire. And I want you to look at the people who are protesting. They are of all different colors and races. You see, as many of you know, I'm a student of history. And if you don't know that, now's the time that you're going to find out. My mother was a history teacher, and my sister was a historian. My mother's favorite thing to teach us about history was that all great societies have two choices: reform or revolt. So to break that down, governments, societies have the option to continue to evolve and reform to best serve their citizenry, or eventually that citizenry will revolt. My sister, her favorite was, you can't know where you're going unless you know where you've been. You see, one who does not know their history may be doomed to repeat it. There have been some awful things to happen throughout history, not just in this country, but all over the world. Today, there are demonstrations happening here in Mobile. There are demonstrations happening all over the world. But understand, whether those demonstrations be peaceful or whether they be violent, the demonstrations are the effect. It is the cause that we must work on. It is the cause and the reason as to why these demonstrations are happening is what we must eliminate as a society. And I hope and I pray that it is nonviolent, that no one gets injured, and that no property is destroyed. Because believe me, it is not from a position of advocacy that I approach that situation. How interesting is it that today there are protests going on all over this world because of a single event that occurred in Minneapolis, Minnesota. There are protests in London. There are protests in Germany. There are protests in all major cities across our nation. What we need to understand is that that has been brought about as chickens coming home to roost. You see, if I mention the word Tulsa to you, what does that bring to your mind? Today is the 99th anniversary of the Tulsa race riots. Now, these weren't African American people coming up in arms against their oppressors. No, this was a city of peaceful African Americans who had built a neighborhood and a society, capitalistic, successful, businesses, not bothering anyone. But the white community in Tulsa resented that. And so they came in and they began to round people up, to take them away, to take their property. And when they resisted, they then brought violence and they began to burn their buildings and burn their businesses. But because that African American community was so fortified and able to fight back, they couldn't do that. So they then enlisted the services of an airplane and a pilot. And they dropped dynamite bombs on this city. And they destroyed it. And when it was all over, there were more than 300 people who were dead. And there were thousands of people who were displaced. And today, we have people blaming looters and rioters for this situation. You know, the tragic part about that situation in Tulsa is that the society then went about erasing it from history. Every person was bound to be quiet about it, and no one ever spoke of it for 70 years. It wasn't taught in schools. Any footage was destroyed. And that's just one instance. But understand that people learn from those examples. Let's talk about the Boston Tea Party, the patriots that started our country. They costumed themselves and went aboard a ship and began to throw tea into the Boston Harbor. Well, that was an illegal act because the British were the rulers, the British were the government, but those patriots decided they weren't going to take that anymore from the king. So they revolted. And a country was born as a result of that revolt. So before you go out and you start judging what people are doing in the mind and the heart of revolt and revolution, look back at history. You see, we always have the opportunity and the option to reform, to avoid these revolts. There have been individuals who have chosen to do it peacefully. Dr. King stood on the principles of non-violence, and then he was killed violently. Medgar Evers, killed violently. And they're just two of many voices who have attempted to stand nonviolently, who have attempted to warn nonviolently. A professional football player chose to take a knee during the national anthem to educate us on violence against African Americans perpetrated by law enforcement. He was vilified and said that he was standing against the troops of these United States, that he was standing against the flag of these United States. Nothing could have been further from the truth. The man utilized his position to bring attention to an injustice. And why would any of us seek a position unless we would use it for the betterment of our society? One should not be vilified for that. And I would be remiss if I did not mention the greatest, Muhammad Ali, vilified for his stance against an unjust war. Now, many years later, we all know that the Vietnam War was started on premises of a lie by our president, Lyndon Baines Johnson. That's just fact that we all know. And eventually, Ali took his place on the throne. But what did he have to go through in order to get there? When are we going to learn that truth, though crushed to the ground, will rise? And we may not like the way that it rises, because I am troubled by the amount of violence that's going on in our country right now. But those things could have been avoided had our governmental institutions chose to reform and treat all of its citizens fairly. When you are sworn to uphold justice and to protect and serve, that is what you should do. That is not an excuse for you to control people. That is not an excuse for you to do what you think is right. It is a reason for you to uphold the rule of law. You see, when the rule of law is applied equally across a spectrum, it's a beautiful thing. It maintains order in our society. But when we begin to pick and choose who we're going to apply the law to and who we're going to let slide, it skews justice because it's evidence that the lady is peeping from under her blindfold. There's a reason that Lady Justice wears a blindfold, because it's supposed to apply to everyone, no matter who is before her. We've got an opportunity here. It's a painful arrival, but we've got an opportunity to reform the way we care for our citizenry. It's unfortunate that it takes the violence that has occurred and that is occurring. But when you don't listen to the masses and you show them that the only thing that you truly care about is capitalistic money, then they begin to destroy that thing upon which you care for, because you've ignored them when they tried everything else. So now everyone has your attention because they're destroying your money. And yeah, there are good people with great businesses who had absolutely nothing to do with any of the wrongful killings that have occurred at the hands of law enforcement. But if you don't speak out and you remain quiet, eventually you become a part of the problem as opposed to the solution. I want everybody to think about that. If you see injustice, you must speak out against it. It's not good enough to say, well, I'm not a racist. Well, that's great. I'm glad. I thank you for not being a racist. But if you don't speak up against a racist, then you're allowing that to perpetuate throughout our society. And if you allow that to perpetuate throughout our society, then eventually those chickens will come home to roost. See, I'm a military veteran. And the first thing that they teach you in boot camp is that if anybody in your company messes up, and they don't use the term messes, everybody's getting punished. Because especially when you're a sailor, you may be the greatest sailor that there is, but you're on a ship with a crew. And if one crewmate messes up and the ship is sank, everybody dies. Whether you are a good sailor or not, whether you did nothing wrong or not, you're as dead as that person who messed up. So if we take that philosophy and we apply it to our society, if you don't straighten out these individuals who are messing up, then our society as a whole is going to suffer. The good right along with the bad. Is it fair? No. But it's real. And reality is where I choose to remain. I'm done.